the people working in the memorial centre are still finding things, possessions of the men who'd gone out there and then were shot. They were buried in many mass graves and sometimes moved from the mass graves as well. So I also went to the centre where they are looking at the remains and able to say whose they are and able to contact their families and say, we found your loved one.
Well, welcome to Political Sandbox by Chamber for today's special episode with Fleur Anderson MP to mark Srebrenica Memorial Day. My name is Benedict Rogers. I'm the co-founder and chief executive of Hong Kong Watch and co-founder of the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission. And I'm also very involved in various parts of the world where these issues of genocide and crimes against humanity are taking place today. I've been deeply involved with the suffering of the Rohingya people in Myanmar, and indeed some of the other ethnic groups in Myanmar who are facing crimes against humanity. The Uyghurs in China, I'm on the advisory group of the Stop Uyghur Genocide campaign.
Yeah.
And I also was very involved in campaigning some years ago for the establishment of a United Nations inquiry into crimes against humanity in North Korea, and co-founded the very long-winded name, the International Coalition to Stop Crimes Against Humanity in North Korea. And of course the UN then had that inquiry and concluded that it very much is crimes against humanity. But Fleur, perhaps I could turn to you and ask, you worked in Bosnia in the aftermath of the war. What was it about that experience that drove your passion for the prevention of atrocities in the future?
That's right. So I'm MP for Putney now, but in my former life I was a development worker with different aid agencies, and I'm, as you're right to say, that I'm chair of the all-party parliamentary group on the prevention of genocide and crimes against humanity. Another long title like the ones you've just mentioned, but very important as well. And I really wanted to do that, I think, because I worked in Bosnia during the war. So in my 20s, I was working in Christian Aid, and a sign went up in the lift. It was before email, so that we couldn't have a round-robin email, saying needed to go and work in Bosnia. Bosnia had been on our TVs for several years by then, and there was that feeling of helplessness I think we feel about Ukraine now. What can I do? And here was a chance to do something. So I went for an interview, and they said in that interview, I'll never forget, they said, have you worked in a conflict situation before? Absolutely not. But I went to go and work in Serbia, and then setting up office in Bosnia and Banja Luka in Bosnia during the war. So I worked under very difficult circumstances, but then also returned 4 years later to work in the north of Bosnia, in Bihać, with my family by then, and we worked there for a year rebuilding villages. And what I saw was that there was, I think sometimes when we talk about genocide, we know about the Holocaust, we've learnt about that, and we can't think it's in the past, we think it's history. But what I saw there was absolutely not. It could happen anywhere to anyone. And peace has to be built all the time. We can't take it for granted, is what I learnt there. And I spoke to people who said that 1 week they would be going to school, they're sending their kids to school, living in a block in what was a very diverse society in Bosnia, where the different religions, people from different countries ethnically, just lived together. They saw themselves as a very progressive, liberal country, and yet literally the next week, people who they'd be sending their children to school, their teachers were firing against them from the other side of the wall where they were in siege in Bihać. Just that your society can disintegrate that quickly was just extraordinary to me, and really sobering, and very, it should concern us all, I think, that it can happen anywhere to anyone. And I really, since then, I've been wanting to work on peace building. So I set up things like Wandsworth Welcomes Refugees here in London, and it's just been something I've just wanted to follow since then, because I also think we often say never again, but as you say, those are examples of places where it is happening right now. We haven't achieved that, never again, and I would like to be part of achieving it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, two people that I've worked with on other issues, the issues I mentioned earlier of Myanmar, North Korea and the Uyghurs, who of course, played a key role in the aftermath of the Bosnia genocide, were Sir Geoffrey Nice QC, who led the prosecution of Milosevic, and Paddy Ashdown, who both of them were founding patrons of Hong Kong Watch. But of course, Paddy Ashdown led the transition.
He led the peace, and afterwards in Bosnia. He's very revered in Bosnia.
Yes.
I was there just 3 weeks ago, and so many people everywhere we went, oh, you're from the UK, Paddy Ashdown.
Right, yes, absolutely. What... we're approaching Srebrenica Memorial Day. What do you think the significance of that particular day is this year? I mean, you mentioned already Ukraine. We now have war in Europe again, and on a scale that I don't think any of us would have predicted until it happened. So what's the particular significance of the Memorial Day this year, given what's going on in Ukraine?
Yes, I think every year we should be commemorating genocides, remembering, saying never again. In Srebrenica, we should never forget that 8,372, mainly men and boys, were murdered then. But yes, with Ukraine, that war seems very close. But there have been conflicts around the world. There still are in Africa and many other places around the world, many all the time, that we need to be saying, is this a genocide? Is this something that could be done that could have prevented that? And what can we do as an international community, but here in the UK as well? We are unusual in the UK, the amount of Srebrenica Memorial events that we hold, the amount that the Bosnian community here has been able to speak out, and rightly so had their voice within it, but also the amount of support that there is, because we want to remember, we want to learn, and we want to say, what can we do to stop that? And the lessons have to be learned for Ukraine, for the conflict right now, what's happening right now, what evidence is being gathered, could we do more, and is there any more we could have done to prevent it? And the theme is combating denial, and right now in Bosnia and Herzegovina there is growing denial of that genocide, of Srebrenica genocide. There are elections later on this year in Bosnia and Herzegovina, so that's why also for the country itself this year, this day is really important to remember. Absolutely.
To what extent does the Bosnian community, either people in Bosnia or the community outside, have contact with people in other parts of the world who are currently going through genocide or crimes against humanity, some of the countries that I mentioned earlier, in order to share experiences, lessons learned, things that Bosnians can do from their experience to speak up for others?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know all about what is happening in this area, but I do know that I was in Bosnia just 3 weeks ago, and I met up with young people from Tuzla who are working on peace building, and they've learnt from other countries. Every country is different, obviously, in every experience, but there are lessons that can be learned across different countries. And so they have learnt those from Northern Ireland, for example. And I know that in Northern Ireland they learnt lessons from South Africa, and so it goes on. And this week is the Freedom of Religion and Belief Ministerial Conference here in London, and 24 young people from different areas of conflict, all either genocidal areas or pre or post, all related to potential genocide, are coming here in London to go to events where we're bringing together people as the all-party parliamentary group. We're bringing together these young people to learn from each other, to share their experiences, and to jointly also talk to the ministers in that important meeting to say, actually, there are lessons that can be learned, there's more that can be done, and here are the shared experiences that people have. So it is important to share those. And I think the Srebrenica Memorial Day, that's one of its roles.
Yes.
It's that opportunity to speak up about what happened then and there, and to say these are the lessons that everyone should learn.
As you said earlier, every time a tragedy, a genocide happens, we all say never again, and then we say never again all over again. And one of the challenges seems to be the reluctance of some governments to actually recognise genocide. The Armenian genocide has not been recognised in many parts of the world. And the Uyghur genocide, which I believe it is, has been recognised as a genocide by the US government and by a number of parliaments around the world, including our own parliament.
I voted for that.
Right,
yes. Yeah.
But our own government still won't call it a genocide. Why do you think there's such a difficulty? I know genocide is obviously a very specific and the highest crime internationally, so it certainly shouldn't be used lightly. But nevertheless, with the body of evidence that there is, why do you think it's so difficult to get governments to recognise genocide when it's happening?
There is a high legal bar, and in the UN, it's always going to be blocked as well if China is part of that decision-making process or other countries that are actually involved. So that was set up just after the Second World War, the system of how we legally define a genocide, but I don't think it's fit for purpose anymore. So we do have this frustration of not being able to call something a genocide, and therefore everything to follow on in terms of stopping it, preventing it, seeking justice. That should happen. So I think this does need to be looked at again. I don't know when or how, who should look at, and maybe you've got some ideas about who should look at that, who should address this situation, so that we don't spend a lot of time arguing over whether the semantics of whether or not it's a genocide, when clearly Armenians, Rohingya, Uyghur, now potentially what's happening in Ukraine could be called a genocide, and that everything else would follow from that. So it's such a blocker to progress on genocide prevention that it does need to be sorted out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was last year that there was an amendment put forward, firstly by Lord Alton in the House of Lords, and then by Nozgani and Ian Duncan Smith and others in the Commons, an amendment to the trade bill that was an effort both to say that we shouldn't trade with countries that are carrying out genocide, but also to empower, I think, the High Court in this country. That was the original idea, to empower the High Court to make genocide determinations. Why do you think the government seemed to throw sort of the kitchen sink at opposing it, and they only defeated it by a very narrow majority? What do you think the government's issue was there?
They seemed, I can't speak for the government, but they seem to want to say that it will be too difficult if it's called out. It will be too difficult to give the courts that amount of power then over governments. And actually it should be the other way around, that governments should be declaring that it should be a political decision rather than a legal decision, was part of the argument against it. But I think that was one very practical way of just putting a suggestion in front of the government and saying, okay, this is one that could work. If you don't agree with it, then you make another suggestion. And what we're waiting for them is to come back with another way that we can address this too. But it doesn't stop us having genocide prevention approaches and going far further than we are already. So the fact that we can't legally define it and therefore go ahead with it, there's so many other things we should be doing. Prevention approaches is something that, as an all-party parliamentary group of parliamentarians, we are calling for across, for example, all of our foreign offices around the world. There could be training in spotting genocide as it begins, because there's this ladder of genocide. It doesn't start with the most atrocious killings. It starts with things like classification, symbolisation, discrimination. There are these ways in which it can be spotted and addressed. And I think we can be doing far more on actually making much more significant prevention approaches across the board, which could stop genocide and stop us having to say never again. So we should go ahead with this legal definition. We should try and address that, but we can do so much more in the meantime as well. I
think that's a really important point. We shouldn't be waiting until it happens to react. We should be trying to prevent it and spot it early on.
That would be a mark of success. We're never talking about a genocide anywhere. But it seems almost, I don't know, it seems like a pipe dream or it's impossible, but I think we should talk about that as well. Why not be ambitious to say they should never happen again, but also we've got to say how, rather than just, and Srebrenica Memorial Days are really important for saying that as well. It's also important for education, so educating people about how this has happened, but also building in that genocide denial into our curriculum right here in the UK too. Absolutely.
Can I ask about accountability? In a number of cases, particularly Bosnia and also Rwanda, there were, of course, international war crimes tribunals and trials. How effective and significant were those trials, and how hopeful are you in the future that, for example, one day Putin and the Russian regime could be held accountable for what they're doing in Ukraine?
Well, it's essential that there's justice seen to be done and people are held to account, especially those leaders at the top who make those decisions. They are hugely significant that we had the trials and that people were jailed as a result. But it was very, very, very slow, very, very cumbersome, and doesn't involve all of the people down the chain that were involved as well. So it could be, the whole system could be far better, far more improved, and that would be far more of a deterrent to people like Putin and all the generals and all of those below who are now committing atrocities that we know of right now. So the justice system is there. It's very important to support it. We should continue to absolutely support the tribunal process, but it does need to be faster, and people need to be able to be absolutely sure that those perpetrators will be brought to justice. And we know in many of the situations, some of those that you've listed, they haven't been brought to justice. So it's not a system that's working well enough at all.
That's right. I mean, it's interesting when I started campaigning, probably around 2010, 2011, for the UN to establish a commission of inquiry on North Korea. At the time, initially, people said, you're wasting your time, the UN will never do it, you're banging your head against a brick wall. But we formed a coalition and we kept at it. And I think we were quite lucky, in addition to our hard work, the composition of the UN Human Rights Council in 2012, I think, or 2013, was all the countries that would have opposed us had rotated off, and it actually consisted of member states that actually believe in human rights. And so the Commission of Inquiry was set up. They produced an incredible report, a really comprehensive report. It was chaired by an Australian judge called Michael Kirby. And they concluded that what's happening in North Korea is crimes against humanity. But of course, nothing's happened since then. The report sits on a shelf and gathers dust, and similar reports have been done on the Rohingya situation.
So who would have the power to take that inquiry to the next step? What would happen next with that inquiry?
Well, I guess it would be member states within the UN system, if enough of them had the political will to do something, and maybe to come together. I mean, it's difficult to ask one country on its own, but an alliance of countries, but there needs to be the political will and the will to take on the opponents, because obviously China and Russia would be pretty strong opponents, but that political will doesn't seem to be there.
No, so it's the legal system and the politics have got to work together, and in fact they're not helping each other sometimes, so the whole system doesn't entirely work. But if you were to take it entirely out of the hands of politicians and just say it's a legal process, you're back to that area of definition again, aren't you? About when would you get above the line and you would trigger the whole process then continuing. But if politicians with different diplomatic relations with the very countries involved are always the ones who are going to call it, we're probably in a system that's stuck. And so those people, it's always those people who's most vulnerable, those who are affected, those who need to see justice. They're not going to see justice, and it's politicians failing at the very beginning all the way through this, and then at the end of the system again. Yes,
that's exactly right. I mean, one of the sort of rare positive examples of a political decision rather than a legal decision, and one that represented also a very rare outbreak of bipartisan agreement in Washington DC, was that on his last day in office as Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo officially recognized the Uyghur situation as a genocide, and then a couple of hours later Antony Blinken, as the new Secretary of State, agreed with that recognition and made the same statement. And that was very encouraging to see two administrations changing office, two different political parties, but coming to the same decision on that issue. So you've mentioned that you were just very recently in Srebrenica, just 3 weeks or so ago. What's the situation there now? What did you find on your visit?
It's definitely a day I will never forget. So I went with a cross-party group of MPs, and we went with the British ambassador to the site and it was really good to see that the UK has been supporting the memorial centre that's been set up in Srebrenica, and that's absolutely the right thing to do. So I went there, and it used to be a big metal factory, and you go in and it's this huge warehouse, and you walk in, and I knew what had happened there, that thousands of men and boys had been taken there, very chaotic circumstances during the war. Then some of them had been held there, many of them had been taken off into the nearby woods and shot where they were. Many others had then been they'd fled, and they'd gone on this march out through the woods, some for many days or even weeks. But many had been ambushed by the opposing army on the way out there, by the Serbian army on the way, and shot where they were in the woods. So there were many sites of the genocide. It's not just one place. It started in this big warehouse, but there were other areas as well in the woodland where the people working in the memorial centre are still finding things, possessions of the men who'd gone out there and then were shot. They were buried in many mass graves, and sometimes moved from the mass graves as well. So I also went to the centre where they are looking at the remains and able to say whose they are, and able to contact their families and say, we found your loved one. And that was very powerful as well, as you can imagine. That even these years on, and I've met several people who were saying, I still don't know if my father, if my brother was there. They still hadn't had that kind of confirmation, which they are getting now slowly, and that many are being buried today on the Memorial Day as well. Every year there are more. It's a very live issue in Srebrenica. And there is genocide denial, and that is increasing now in that area, the Republika Srpska of Bosnia. So the local schools don't visit that site. They don't want to acknowledge that this happened in the local area, which I thought was very chilling, to know that this is something the story that needs to be told in the most local area, as well as across the whole of Bosnia Herzegovina and across the world. So that's another reason why Memorial Day is so important.
Absolutely. This issue of genocide denial is really troubling. How today is the relationship between Bosnia Herzegovina and the other neighbouring countries that it used to be part of, the former Yugoslavia, with Serbia, Croatia and so on?
There's good relationships with the countries around, although it's the influence of Russia and Serbia on the Republika Srpska side of Bosnia, which is worrying with the elections coming up as well. But within Bosnia Herzegovina, I think the question is about this fragile peace. So the Dayton Peace Agreement was set up back in 1995 as the way of achieving the end of the war, but it has achieved peace since then. I mean, even the 4 years later when I went back, it wasn't certain whether or not it would go back to war or would stay peaceful. But the fact that it's been a peace there for so many years is good. But there are lots of governments within the country, within a small country. There's a lot of political sort of blockages and impasse because the Dayton Peace Agreement was good for its time, but now needs to be looked at again. Everyone agrees it needs to be looked at again, but opening that Pandora's box is a really difficult thing to do. So it needs to have that support from the countries around it, yes, but also from the UK. That's a role we can play in peace building, in saying that there needs to be new agreements for the country. We support peace, we oppose genocide denial, we oppose weapons being built up, we oppose any moves towards conflict. It's really important for Bosnia at the moment.
Absolutely. So the theme of Srebrenica Memorial Day is combating denial and challenging hatred. Why is this such an important theme, and what is the impact of ongoing denial of genocide?
So if genocide is denied, you lose the ability to build peace in communities and to get the justice you need for those perpetrators. So first of all, you can't have communities where on one side they know an atrocity was committed to their community, and on the other side that's being denied by those who potentially are often the case in power. The decisions they're making are not going to be ones which bring about community cohesion. It's absolutely the opposite. They are maintaining division by denying the very thing which is the most important to one side of the community. So it's essential for peace building. It's an absolute first building block. but also for justice. You can't get justice for against those perpetrators if it's denied from happening at all. So you can see it with the Uyghurs at the moment in China. There can't be justice if it's claimed by the authorities that there are no perpetrators. There will be no end. So bringing about an end to existing genocides, but also about bringing about real peace in those countries where genocide has happened. South Africa and Rwanda are both very interesting examples of countries where there have been mass division on ethnic lines, and yet they've managed to achieve some kind of reconciliation moving forward as a country. But it takes a huge amount of courage, and it takes a willingness by the perpetrators to acknowledge what went on, and then to build from there. So if you don't have that, you won't have what we need in the world, which is peace, and to stop those divisions between communities. That's why combating genocide denial is part of combating hatred and essential for building peace.
Absolutely. One of the first parts of the world that I first got involved with in terms of human rights advocacy and travelled to quite a lot was East Timor, and that's another example similar to South Africa and Rwanda, because although the population in East Timor itself is largely one ethnicity, there was of course huge trauma and anger and real suffering as a result of the horrific violence that the Indonesian occupation unleashed on East Timor, but throughout the 24-year occupation, and particularly around the referendum in 1999. But it was remarkable, the East Timorese leaders, when the country became independent and free, they deliberately chose not to seek a prosecution of the top Indonesian generals or politicians who had masterminded the. It was never recognised as a genocide, but it probably was a genocide. So certainly real atrocities. But they felt that their relationship with Indonesia as a small new independent nation, it was more important to have reconciliation than to have prosecution. They did have an ad hoc tribunal within East Timor to a sort of truth and reconciliation process similar to South Africa, and that appears to have worked for them, which is encouraging.
That just shows every country is going to be different. Every outcome, it's got to be negotiated by everyone involved.
Yeah.
And then every outcome will be different. And yet, to hear the stories of where peace can be achieved is really important. It's important to tell that story and others, that it doesn't have to be like this. There doesn't have to be a genocide. We could say never again. That would be the best outcome.
Absolutely, and that's the message of this day, the Srebrenica Memorial Day, is to really say never again and actually mean it. Well, thank you very much, Fleur, for speaking with us today. Obviously not an easy topic by any means, but it's been a pleasure to meet you and to have the discussion.
Really good discussion.
Absolutely. And Chamber is the community voice. You can join the conversation if you enjoyed is probably the wrong word, but if you found this conversation interesting and stimulating, you can follow Chamber at Twitter at Chamber Voice, on Instagram at Chamber UK. You can visit the website, which is chamberuk.com, or email us at info@chamberuk.com.